They whispered she was just another desperate frontier woman trying to scratch out a living in the dust and heat of Willowbrook Territory. A simple seamstress who mended torn shirts and patched worn boots for the miners and cattle hands. But what Judge Harrison Caldwell never suspected was that behind those calloused hands lived the soul of an artist, and within that weathered throat rested a voice that could make angels weep. What he couldn't have imagined was that this unassuming woman would orchestrate his complete destruction using nothing more than music, cunning, and the one weakness every powerful man believes he doesn't have. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The summer of 1885 had been merciless to Willowbrook Territory, baking the wooden sidewalks until they creaked like old bones, and turning the main street into a river of choking dust that coated everything from the general store windows to the fresh paint on St. Mary's Chapel. Emma Blackwood stood at her small window above the seamstress shop, watching the morning sun cast long shadows across the settlement that had become both her refuge and her prison. At 26, she possessed the kind of quiet beauty that frontier life often wore away from women, but her green eyes held depths that spoke of education, refinement, and secrets carefully guarded. The sound of hammering echoed from the construction site, where ambitious townspeople were slowly raising what they hoped would become the Willowbrook Opera House. Emma watched the workers, their shirts soaked with sweat, their faces bright with the optimism of men building something greater than themselves. They had no idea that their dreams of bringing culture and sophistication to their growing town were being systematically crushed by the very man they trusted to protect their interests. Judge Harrison Caldwell ruled Willowbrook Territory with the iron fist of legal authority, but his justice came with a price that few could afford and fewer still dared to question. From his imposing courthouse that dominated the center of town, he had transformed what should have been blind justice into a personal empire built on fear, manipulation, and the careful exploitation of frontier desperation. Every land dispute, every mining claim, every business license passed through his hands, and each decision seemed to favor those who understood the unspoken tax of loyalty that kept his pockets lined and his power absolute. Emma had been watching this corruption unfold for 3 years, ever since she had arrived in Willowbrook, with nothing but a small sewing kit and a past she never discussed. She had rented the tiny room above Marcus Webb's building, established her seamstress business, and become part of the invisible infrastructure that kept frontier life functioning. She mended the clothes that working men tore on barbed wire and machinery. She altered the dresses that hopeful women wore to Sunday services, and she listened to the quiet conversations that revealed the true cost of Caldwell's reign. The stories came to her in fragments, whispered over fittings and alterations. Mrs. Dorothy Kane, the elderly widow whose husband had built the largest ranch in Copper Creek Valley, found herself facing legal challenges to her land ownership. Every few months, each one requiring expensive legal fees that somehow always ended up in Caldwell's personal accounts. Marcus Webb, who owned the Golden Horseshoe Saloon where Emma rented her space, paid monthly protection fees disguised as licensing costs, fees that had no basis in territorial law but carried the implicit threat of business closure for non-compliance. Dr. James Hartwell stopped by Emma's shop regularly, ostensibly to have his shirts repaired, but really to vent his frustration about the increasing number of patients he treated for mysterious accidents. Men who questioned Caldwell's rulings seemed prone to falls, equipment failures, and other mishaps that left them injured, impoverished, and much more cooperative with the judge's future decisions. Tom Mitchell, the earnest young editor of the Willowbrook Gazette, had learned to write carefully around certain topics after his printing press suffered a devastating fire following an editorial that questioned the fairness of recent land redistributions. What none of these good people knew was that Emma Blackwood possessed weapons far more powerful than they could imagine. Her fingers, which they saw carefully stitching fabric and threading needles, had once danced across piano keys in the finest conservatories of Boston and New York. Her voice, which they heard only in gentle conversation and polite greetings, had been trained by masters who recognized a rare and extraordinary talent. Her mind, which they assumed held only the practical knowledge of frontier survival, had been educated in literature, languages, and the subtle arts of performance that could transform a simple song into an instrument of power. Emma had fled to the frontier not from poverty or lack of opportunity, but from a scandal that had threatened to destroy her family's reputation in Boston society. The daughter of a respected music professor, she had been groomed for a career on the opera stages of Europe, but a romantic entanglement with a married patron of the arts had forced her to choose between disgrace and exile. She had chosen exile, traveling west with a broken heart, but with her talent intact, hoping to disappear into the anonymity of frontier life. For 3 years she had succeeded in remaining invisible, supporting herself through honest work while carefully observing the community she had accidentally joined. But the construction of the opera house had awakened something in her soul that simple survival could no longer contain. She found herself humming arias while she worked, her fingers tapping out complex rhythms against her work table, her dreams filled with the memory of spotlights and the thunder of applause. Father Gabriel Santos had been the first to suspect that Emma was more than she appeared. A young priest who had come to Willowbrook with his own mysterious past, possessed an educated ear for music, and had noticed the unconscious perfection of Emma's pitch when she joined the congregation. In Sunday hymns, he had begun lingering after services, engaging her in conversations about music and culture that revealed depths of knowledge that no simple seamstress should possess. It was Father Santos who had first suggested, with careful diplomacy, that Emma might consider contributing her voice to the church choir. She had deflected the suggestion with practiced skill, claiming that her voice was too rough for such refined music. But the priest's knowing smile suggested that he heard the lie. Beneath her modesty, he had begun leaving sheet music on her workbench when he brought his vestments for mending, pieces that grew progressively more complex and demanding, as if testing the limits of her hidden abilities. The breaking point came on a sweltering Tuesday morning when Mrs. Kane arrived at Emma's shop with tears streaming down her weathered face and legal papers clutched in her trembling hands. Judge Caldwell had ruled that her late husband's will was invalid due to technical irregularities, and that the Kane Ranch would be sold at public auction to satisfy outstanding debts that had mysteriously appeared on the court records. The auction was scheduled for the following month, and Mrs. Kane knew as well as everyone else in town that the only bidder would be one of Caldwell's associates, acquiring the valuable property for a fraction of its worth. Emma had comforted the older woman as best she could, brewing tea and offering words of sympathy while her mind raced through possibilities. Mrs. Kane's ranch represented more than just property. It was a symbol of everything that Willowbrook Territory could become if honest people were allowed to build without fear of corruption. The loss of the ranch would demonstrate to every citizen that no amount of hard work, no legal ownership, no community standing could protect them from Caldwell's greed if they possessed something he wanted. That evening, Emma climbed to the roof of her building and looked out over the town that had become her home. The half-finished opera house stood like a promise in the twilight, its skeletal frame reaching toward the star-filled sky with desperate optimism. She thought about the dreams of the people who were building it, their belief that culture and beauty could flourish even in the harsh environment of the frontier. She thought about Mrs. Kane's tears, Tom Mitchell's careful words, Doctor. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Hartwell's frustrated silence, and all the other small surrenders that were slowly strangling the spirit of a community that deserved better. In that moment, Emma Blackwood made a decision that would change everything. She would not remain hidden any longer. She would not allow her talent to waste away in the safety of anonymity, while good people suffered under the boot of corruption. She would use every skill she possessed, every weapon in her considerable arsenal, to bring down the man who had turned justice into a personal profit center. But she would not attack directly, as others had tried and failed. She would not write angry editorials or challenge legal decisions or organize protests that could be easily crushed. Instead, she would give Judge Harrison Caldwell exactly what his arrogance had always craved: the attention and admiration of a beautiful woman who seemed completely within his power to control. She would become the most devastating opponent he had ever faced by appearing to be no opponent at all. The plan that began forming in Emma's mind was as elegant as it was audacious. She would transform herself from an invisible seamstress into the most captivating performer Willowbrook Territory had ever seen. She would use her voice to entrance not just the judge, but the entire community, building an audience that would witness his downfall. She would gather evidence of his corruption, not through dangerous snooping, but through the intimate conversations that powerful men shared with women they believed they could trust. Most importantly, she would document everything. Every bribe, every threat, every illegal decision would be recorded and preserved, creating a case so damning that not even Caldwell's connections in the territorial government could save him. But the evidence would come to light not through accusations that could be dismissed or witnesses who could be intimidated, but through a public performance so spectacular that the truth would be impossible to ignore. Emma spent the rest of that week making quiet preparations. She wrote careful letters to contacts in the East, requesting sheet music and performance materials that would support her emerging plan. She began subtle conversations with Father Santos, Tom Mitchell, and other trusted community members, planting seeds of ideas that would grow into crucial support when she needed it most. She started paying closer attention to Judge Caldwell's routines and preferences, noting his habits and identifying the weaknesses in his armor of power. The transformation she was planning would require every skill she had ever learned, every lesson from her years of training, and every ounce of courage she could summon. She would have to become someone completely different while remaining fundamentally herself, walk a tightrope between deception and truth that would challenge her abilities in ways that no performance stage ever had. But as Emma looked out over Willowbrook Territory, watching the lights flicker on in windows where honest families were settling in for the night, she felt a sense of purpose that had been missing from her life since she had fled Boston. She was no longer running from her past. She was running toward a future where her talents would serve something greater than her own ambitions. The voice that had once been destined for opera houses in Vienna and Paris would instead be used to bring justice to a frontier town that had almost given up hope. Judge Harrison Caldwell had built his empire on the belief that power could crush talent, that authority could silence truth, and that fear could defeat hope. He was about to learn that he had made the greatest mistake of his corrupt career by underestimating a woman who possessed the most dangerous weapon of all, the ability to make people believe in something better than what they had, and the skill to show them exactly how to get it. Parts 2 to 5. The escalation begins. The first test of Emma's resolve came sooner than she expected. 3 days after her midnight decision on the rooftop, she watched through her shop window as Chester Vale, Judge Caldwell's hulking enforcer, emerged from the Golden Horseshoe Saloon with a satisfied smirk that made her stomach turn. Marcus Webb followed behind him, his usually jovial face pale and drawn, the kind of expression that came from having no good choices left to make. Emma set down her sewing and stepped outside, catching Marcus as he slumped against the hitching post in front of his establishment. The saloon owner looked older than his 43 years, his shoulders bent under the weight of accumulated compromises and forced silence. When he noticed Emma approaching, he straightened slightly, attempting to restore the facade of normalcy. That kept Willowbrook functioning despite the rot at its core. "Afternoon, Miss Blackwood," Marcus managed, though his voice carried none of its usual warmth. "Hope the hammering from the construction isn't disturbing your work too much." Emma studied his face, noting the fresh bruise along his jawline that he was trying to hide behind a carefully maintained smile. "The noise doesn't bother me, Mr. Webb, but you look like something's troubling you more than construction sounds." Ever could. For a moment, Marcus seemed ready to deflect with another pleasantry, but something in Emma's green eyes encouraged honesty in a way that few people in Willowbrook had experienced. The careful mask slipped, revealing exhaustion and frustration that ran bone deep. "It's nothing new," he said quietly, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. "Just the monthly conversation about operating expenses and community safety. Seems like both keep getting more expensive." Emma nodded, understanding the coded language that had become necessary for survival in their town. Operating expenses meant bribes. Community safety meant protection from the very people who were supposed to provide it. The bruise on Marcus's jaw suggested that this month's conversation had been more persuasive than usual. "I don't suppose there's any recourse through official channels," Emma said carefully. "Someone who might take an interest in fair business practices." Marcus laughed bitterly, the sound carrying no humor at all. "Official channels run right through Judge Caldwell's courthouse, Miss Blackwood. And the judge takes a very personal interest in making sure all business practices serve the greater good." His definition of greater good, naturally. That evening, Emma made her way to St. Mary's Chapel for what appeared to be a routine visit, but was actually reconnaissance. Father Gabriel Santos was alone in the sanctuary, preparing for evening prayers, his movements careful and deliberate as he arranged candles and straightened hymnals. When he noticed Emma entering, his face brightened with genuine pleasure, though she caught a flicker of concern in his dark eyes. "Miss Blackwood," Father Santos said warmly, "you're early for evening service. Or perhaps you've come to discuss those musical arrangements I left at your shop." Emma smiled, appreciating his subtlety. The priest understood the value of speaking carefully in a town where words could be weaponized against their speakers. "Actually, Father, I've been thinking about what you said regarding community involvement. Perhaps it's time I considered contributing more than just needle and thread to Willowbrook's future." The priest's eyebrows rose slightly, and Emma caught the quick assessment in his gaze. Father Santos possessed the kind of intelligence that came from education and experience, the ability to read between lines and understand implications that others might miss. He gestured toward one of the front pews, inviting her to sit while he continued his preparations. "Community involvement takes many forms," he said thoughtfully. "Some people contribute through business, others through civic leadership. But the most powerful contributions often come from those who can inspire others to see possibilities they hadn't imagined." Emma settled into the wooden pew, her mind racing through the implications of his words. "And what kind of inspiration do you think Willowbrook needs most, Father?" Father Santos paused in his work, candle in hand, his expression growing serious. "This town was built by people who believed in something better than what they were leaving behind. But belief requires cultivation, Miss Blackwood. It requires reminders of what we're capable of achieving when we work together toward common goals. And when those common goals are being undermined by people in positions of trust," Emma said quietly. The priest's movement stilled completely. For a long moment, the only sound in the chapel was the whisper of evening wind through the partially open windows. When Father Santos finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of carefully considered words. "Evil flourishes when good people believe they have no power to resist it," he said. "But sometimes resistance requires patience, strategy, and weapons that tyrants don't recognize as threats until it's too late to defend against them." Emma felt a thrill of recognition. The priest understood far more than his careful words revealed. He was offering alliance without stating it directly, support without compromising either of their positions. More importantly, he was confirming that others in Willowbrook were ready for change if someone could show them how to achieve it safely. "Father," Emma said carefully, "hypothetically speaking, if someone were to organize a cultural event to raise spirits and bring the community together, what kind of support might such an endeavor receive?" Father Santos resumed his candle lighting, but Emma caught the small smile that crossed his features. "Hypothetically, I believe this community would embrace any opportunity to celebrate the finer aspects of human achievement. Music, in particular, has a way of reaching hearts that speeches and sermons cannot touch. And if such an event were to attract attention from territorial officials," Emma pressed, "people who might not appreciate civilians organizing independent activities." "Well," the priest said thoughtfully, "territorial officials are generally supportive of cultural advancement. They understand that civilization requires more than just law and order. It requires beauty, inspiration, and the kind of refinement that elevates the human spirit." Emma nodded, understanding the deeper message. Public cultural events would be difficult for Caldwell to oppose without appearing backward and tyrannical. More importantly, such events would create opportunities for community members to gather, share information, and begin coordinating resistance efforts under the cover of innocent entertainment. The next morning brought devastating news that accelerated Emma's timeline considerably. Tom Mitchell arrived at her shop before dawn, his face grim and his hands shaking as he clutched a manila envelope containing legal documents that would reshape Willowbrook's future. "Miss Blackwood," Tom said without preamble, "I need to show you something that can't wait for normal business hours. But first, I need your word that what I'm about to share won't leave this room unless you decide to act on it." Emma poured coffee from the pot she kept constantly brewing, noting the exhaustion in Tom's eyes and the careful way he held his left arm. "You have my word, Mr. Mitchell, but first, let me ask if you've seen Dr. Hartwell about that arm." Tom glanced down at his injury with surprise, as if he'd forgotten about it entirely. "Fell down some stairs last night. Clumsy of me, really. Amazing how often people seem to lose their footing when they're carrying sensitive information." Emma handed him the coffee and settled into her work chair, projecting the calm attentiveness that encouraged people to trust her with their secrets. Tom opened the envelope with exaggerated care, revealing documents that made Emma's breath catch in her throat. "These are preliminary surveying reports," Tom explained, spreading the papers across Emma's work table. "Official territorial documents that somehow found their way to my office through channels I can't reveal. They show planned railroad development through Copper Creek Valley with projected completion in 18 months. Emma studied the maps and technical drawings, immediately understanding the implications. Railroad access would transform Willowbrook from an isolated frontier settlement into a significant commercial hub. Property values would increase exponentially, mining operations would become vastly more profitable, and anyone who controlled large landholdings would become extraordinarily wealthy. "Mrs. Kane's ranch," Emma said quietly, "sits directly in the path of the proposed main line," Tom confirmed, "along with 3 other properties that have been experiencing unusual legal challenges lately. Properties that are scheduled for public auction over the next 2 months. Emma's mind raced through the connections. Caldwell wasn't just engaging in petty corruption. He was orchestrating a massive land grab that would position him to profit enormously from development he knew was coming, but that the current property owners had no knowledge of. The railroad information was clearly confidential, available only to territorial officials and their chosen associates. "How many people know about this railroad development?" Emma asked. "Officially, maybe a dozen territorial administrators. Unofficially?" Tom shrugged. "Whoever has enough money or influence to buy early access to information that should be public." Emma stood and moved to her window, looking out at the half-finished opera house with new understanding. The building project wasn't just about cultural aspiration. It was about establishing Willowbrook as the kind of sophisticated community that railroad developers would want to serve. The Opera House was an investment in the town's future, which made Caldwell's corruption even more destructive. "Mr. Mitchell," Emma said slowly, "how long do you think it would take to organize a significant cultural event? Something that would attract attention from outside Willowbrook?" Tom's eyebrows rose. "What kind of cultural event?" "A performance," Emma said, ideas crystallizing as she spoke. "Something sophisticated enough to demonstrate that Willowbrook is ready for the kind of growth that railroad access would bring. Something that would attract territorial officials, potential investors, and perhaps even some of those railroad developers." "You're talking about accelerating the timeline," Tom said, understanding immediately. "Forcing Caldwell to show his hand before he's ready." Emma nodded. "If we can create an event that brings outside scrutiny to Willowbrook, it becomes much harder for him to continue operating in the shadows. But more importantly, if we can demonstrate that this community is capable of achieving something remarkable, it changes how people think about their own power." Tom studied her face with the intense attention of a man accustomed to reading between lines. "Miss Blackwood, with respect, organizing the kind of performance you're describing would require resources, connections, and expertise that most frontier seamstresses don't possess." Emma met his gaze steadily. "Perhaps it's time for Willowbrook to discover that its residents possess more varied talents than anyone suspected." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Hartwell, who entered Emma's shop with the brisk efficiency of a man accustomed to treating injuries that patients preferred not to discuss in detail. He nodded to Tom and Emma, then began examining the editor's arm with practiced hands. "Stairs can be treacherous," Dr. Hartwell said conversationally as he worked, "especially when they're constructed poorly or when people are distracted by weighty matters. I've treated an unusual number of stair-related injuries lately." Emma watched the doctor work, noting the careful way he handled Tom's arm and the knowing look that passed between the two men. Dr. Hartwell clearly understood that Tom's injury wasn't accidental, just as he understood that many of his other recent patients had been victims of systematic intimidation rather than mere misfortune. "Doctor," Emma said carefully, "in your medical opinion, would you say that Willowbrook citizens are generally healthy enough to participate in vigorous community activities?" Dr. Hartwell finished wrapping Tom's arm before answering. "Physical health is only part of overall wellness, Miss Blackwood. Emotional and spiritual health matter just as much. I'd say this community could benefit enormously from activities that restore hope and demonstrate collective strength. And if such activities were to attract attention from people who prefer Willowbrook to remain quietly compliant," Emma pressed. "Well," the doctor said thoughtfully, "in my experience, people who threaten others for engaging in lawful activities are generally suffering from a condition that responds poorly to accommodation. The most effective treatment is usually sustained exposure to organized resistance." Emma felt pieces of her plan clicking into place. She had allies who understood the stakes and were ready to support bold action. She had information that revealed the scope of Caldwell's corruption. Most importantly, she had a strategy that would allow her to use her greatest weapon without revealing it until the moment of maximum impact. "Gentlemen," Emma said, decision crystallizing in her voice, "I believe it's time for Willowbrook to announce its first annual cultural celebration. A week-long festival culminating in a performance that will demonstrate this community's commitment to artistic excellence and civic progress." Tom and Dr. Hartwell exchanged glances, recognizing that something significant was being proposed even if they didn't understand all the implications. "Miss Blackwood," Tom said slowly, organizing such an event would require enormous effort and considerable risk. Are you certain you understand what you're suggesting?" Emma smiled, feeling more confident than she had since arriving in Willowbrook 3 years earlier. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm beginning to suspect that none of us fully understand what we're capable of achieving until we decide to stop accepting limitations that others have imposed on us." Dr. Hartwell packed his medical bag with deliberate care. "Well, whatever you're planning, you'll have the full support of everyone who believes this town deserves better than what it's been getting. Just remember that some people will fight very hard to prevent change, especially when they have a lot to lose." Emma nodded, her mind already racing ahead to the details of execution. She would need to move carefully but quickly, building support while avoiding direct confrontation, until she was ready to spring her trap. Most importantly, she would need to begin her own transformation, preparing for the performance that would either liberate Willowbrook or destroy her in the attempt. That afternoon, Emma locked her shop and made her way to the construction site where the opera house was slowly taking shape. The workers had made significant progress since her last visit, with walls beginning to rise around the wooden framework and the stage area clearly defined in the growing structure. She stood in what would eventually become the center aisle, imagining the space filled with an audience hungry for beauty and inspiration. She could almost hear the echo of her own voice filling the space, carrying notes that would transform doubt into certainty and fear into courage. But first, she had to ensure that when opening night arrived, Judge Harrison Caldwell would be sitting in the front row, completely unaware that he was about to witness his own downfall. The real work was just beginning. Parts 6 to 9, The Hidden. Depths emerge. Emma's first glimpse of her true capabilities came during a quiet Sunday evening when Father Santos asked her to stay after the regular service to discuss music for the upcoming harvest celebration. The chapel was empty except for the two of them, golden candlelight flickering across the wooden pews and casting dancing shadows on the walls adorned with simple, religious artwork donated by grateful parishioners. "Miss Blackwood," Father Santos said as he gathered the evening's hymnals, "I've been thinking about our conversation regarding community inspiration. There's something I'd like you to hear." He moved to the small organ at the front of the chapel, an instrument that had been donated by a mining family who struck silver the previous year. Emma had always admired its craftsmanship, but had never heard it played with true skill. Father Santos settled onto the bench and began to play, his fingers finding a melody that was both familiar and extraordinary. The opening notes of Puccini's "O mio babbino caro" filled the chapel with such beauty that Emma felt her breath catch. She had heard this aria performed in Boston's finest opera houses, had studied it herself under masters who demanded perfection, but never had it sounded more achingly beautiful than it did in this simple frontier chapel. Father Santos played with the technical skill of a conservatory graduate, his understanding of the piece revealing musical education that went far beyond what any small-town priest should possess. When he finished, the silence that followed was profound, filled with the kind of reverence that only true artistry could inspire. "Father," Emma said softly, "where did you learn to play like that?" The priest smiled, his dark eyes holding secrets that Emma recognized because she carried similar ones herself. "I studied at the Rome Conservatory before I felt called to religious service. Music was my first language before I learned to speak with God." Emma moved closer to the organ, her trained ear having caught nuances in his performance that revealed not just technical skill but deep emotional understanding of the piece. "You played that as someone who has heard it performed by masters." "As have you, I suspect," Father Santos replied quietly. "Your reaction wasn't that of someone encountering Puccini for the first time." For a moment, Emma felt the walls she had built around her past beginning to crack. Standing in the candlelit chapel with a man who clearly understood the power of music, she felt an almost overwhelming urge to reveal everything. But 3 years of careful hiding had taught her caution, even with those who seemed trustworthy. "I may have had more exposure to classical music than most frontier residents," Emma admitted carefully. Father Santos nodded, understanding her need for discretion. Music creates bonds between people that transcend circumstances, Miss Blackwood. When two people share a deep appreciation for artistic excellence, they often find they can trust each other in ways that mere words cannot establish. He began to play again, this time choosing a piece that made Emma's heart race with recognition and longing. The opening notes of Visidarte from Tosca filled the chapel, each phrase bringing back memories of her life in Boston, of teachers who had praised her interpretation of this very aria, of audiences who had wept at her performance. Without conscious thought, Emma began to hum along, her voice finding the melody with the precision that came from years of training. Father Santos heard the change in the chapel's acoustics and smiled, his playing becoming more confident and expressive as he realized he was no longer performing alone. The humming gradually became soft singing as Emma found herself unable to resist the pull of the music she had denied herself for 3 years. Her voice, carefully hidden for so long, emerged with the kind of power and beauty that could transform any space into a cathedral of human emotion. Father Santos played with increasing passion, clearly recognizing that he was accompanying a voice of extraordinary quality. Emma's singing grew stronger and more confident, years of suppressed artistry pouring out in waves of sound that seemed to make the very walls of the chapel resonate with new life. When the aria reached its climactic moment, Emma's voice soared, with such power and beauty that Father Santos actually stopped playing for a moment, overwhelmed by what he was hearing. In the sudden silence, Emma realized what she had done, what she had revealed, and the magnitude of the step she had just taken. "My dear child," Father Santos whispered, his voice filled with awe. That was not the voice of a seamstress who enjoys music. That was the voice of someone who has trained with masters. Emma felt tears threatening, emotions that she had kept carefully controlled for 3 years suddenly demanding expression. "Father, I need you to understand that there are reasons why I haven't shared this part of myself. Reasons that have nothing to do with false modesty and everything to do with survival." The priest rose from the organ bench and moved to face her directly, his expression serious but compassionate. "Miss Blackwood, whatever brought you to Willowbrook, whatever you're running from or hiding from, it doesn't change what I just heard. God doesn't give gifts like yours to be buried in silence, even when using those gifts could bring danger to the people around me," Emma asked. "Especially then," Father Santos replied firmly, "because that suggests your gifts are needed for something far more important than personal satisfaction." Over the following days, Emma found herself unable to forget the feeling of letting her voice free, even briefly. The memory of singing with full power and expression haunted her as she went through the motions of her seamstress routine, taking measurements and mending tiers while her mind wandered to possibilities she had thought permanently closed to her. The catalyst for her next revelation came when Billy Harper, the young deputy who worked under Judge Caldwell's direct authority, appeared at her shop late one evening with a request that surprised her with its implications. Billy was barely 22, earnest and idealistic in the way that young men could be before the world taught them cynicism. He had grown up in Willowbrook, the son of homesteaders who had worked themselves to death, building a small farm that was now thriving. Under his management, he had taken the deputy position, believing he could serve his community while learning the law. But Emma could see that recent experiences had begun to challenge his faith in the justice system he served. "Miss Blackwood," Billy said, removing his hat and turning it nervously in his hands, "I hope you don't mind me coming by so late. I wanted to speak with you about something, but I needed to wait until I was off duty." Emma invited him in, noting the careful way he looked around before speaking, as if making sure they couldn't be overheard. The young deputy's caution suggested that he was about to share something that could get him in serious trouble with his superiors. "I've been hearing talk around town about some kind of cultural festival being planned," Billy said carefully. "People seem excited about it, but I wanted to warn you that Judge Caldwell has been asking questions about who's organizing community events without proper permits." Emma felt a chill of concern but kept her expression neutral. That's very thoughtful of you, Deputy Harper. Are there specific permits required for cultural activities? Billy's discomfort was obvious as he struggled with conflicting loyalties. Well, that's just it, Miss Blackwood. I've been through all the territorial statutes, and I can't find any legal requirement for permits for community cultural events. But the judge insists that anything involving public gatherings needs his personal approval. Emma recognized the young man's dilemma. He was discovering that his oath to uphold the law was coming into conflict with orders from his superior that had no legal basis. Worse, he was beginning to understand that questioning those orders could have serious consequences for his career and possibly his safety. Deputy Harper, Emma said gently, hypothetically speaking, what would happen if someone organized a cultural event without seeking the judge's approval? Billy's jaw tightened with frustration. Hypothetically, that person might find themselves facing charges for disturbing the peace, unlawful assembly, or any number of other violations that seem to get created as needed. The territorial law books are thick, Miss Blackwood, and they can be interpreted many different ways. Emma nodded, understanding that Billy was warning her about more than just permit requirements. He was telling her that Caldwell would use any excuse to shut down activities that threatened his control, regardless of their legality. I appreciate your concern, Deputy, Emma said, but I'm curious about something. In your opinion, based on your study of territorial law, what would constitute legitimate grounds for investigating public officials who might be overstepping their legal authority? Billy's eyes sharpened with interest. The question touched on something he had obviously been thinking about, and Emma could see that her careful phrasing gave him permission to express doubts he had been keeping to himself. Well, Billy said slowly, territorial law is pretty clear. That public officials can't use their positions for personal gain. And they can't create legal requirements that don't actually exist in the statutes. If someone had evidence of those kinds of violations, they could file complaints with the territorial governor's office. And what kind of evidence would be convincing to territorial authorities? Emma pressed. Billy thought carefully before answering. Documentation would be crucial. Financial records, witness statements, proof of decisions that violated established law. But the evidence would need to be overwhelming, because challenging a sitting judge is serious business. Emma felt pieces of her strategy clicking into place. Billy Harper represented something invaluable, a source inside Caldwell's operation who was beginning to question his superior's methods. More importantly, he had access to legal knowledge that could help her understand exactly what kind of evidence would be needed to build an unshakable case. Deputy Harper, Emma said, if someone were theoretically gathering such evidence, would they be able to count on support from law enforcement officers who believed in upholding actual law rather than personal interpretation? Billy met her gaze directly, and Emma saw the moment when the young man made a decision that would define his character. Miss Blackwood, I took an oath to serve justice, not any particular person. If someone had real evidence of corruption, they'd have my support, regardless of who was involved. That night, Emma began preparing for the most dangerous phase of her plan. She needed to get close enough to Judge Caldwell to gather the kind of damning evidence that Billy had described, but doing so would require her to become someone completely different from the invisible seamstress she had been for 3 years. She started by writing letters to contacts in Boston and New York, carefully worded requests for materials and information that would support her transformation. She needed sheet music for specific pieces that would showcase her abilities while serving her strategic purposes. She needed information about Caldwell's background and connections that might reveal weaknesses she could exploit. Most importantly, she needed to understand exactly who would be attending the territorial development meetings, where railroad plans were being discussed. The letters were sent through Tom Mitchell, who had developed a network of reliable mail carriers who could ensure that, Sensitive correspondence reached its destination without passing through local postal services that might be monitored. In return, Emma shared information she had gathered about Caldwell's financial irregularities, details that Tom could use to build his own investigation while maintaining plausible deniability about their source. Emma's transformation began with subtle changes that wouldn't attract immediate attention. She started paying more attention to her appearance, investing in better fabric for her own dresses, and taking time with her hair that she hadn't bothered with for years. She began carrying herself with more confidence, the kind of bearing that came naturally to someone accustomed to being the center of attention. More importantly, she began strategic conversations with key members of the community, carefully planting seeds of ideas that would grow into crucial support when she needed it. She spoke with Rebecca Stone about the possibility of creating costumes for theatrical performances. She discussed with Marcus Webb the potential for his saloon to host sophisticated entertainment that would attract visitors from other territories. Each conversation served multiple purposes, building the infrastructure she would need while also identifying who could be trusted with sensitive information and who might inadvertently reveal her plans to the wrong people. Emma was creating a network of allies while maintaining the fiction that she was simply an enthusiastic community member interested in cultural improvement. The breakthrough came when her first package arrived from Boston, containing sheet music and a letter from her former voice teacher that changed everything about her timeline. Professor Margaret Whitman, who had trained some of the finest opera singers in America, had written with news that accelerated Emma's plans considerably. Professor Whitman informed Emma that a group of territorial investors and railroad developers would be touring potential development sites in the region within 6 weeks, and that they had specifically requested information about communities that demonstrated cultural sophistication and civic organization. The professor had taken the liberty of mentioning Willowbrook's planned cultural festival, suggesting that it might be worth including in their tour. Emma realized that fate had presented her with the perfect opportunity. If she could organize a performance impressive enough to attract these influential visitors, she would have an audience for her revelation of Caldwell's corruption that would ensure swift action and prevent any possibility of cover-up or retaliation. But 6 weeks was an impossibly short time to prepare for the kind of performance she envisioned, especially while maintaining her cover as a simple seamstress. She would need to begin revealing her abilities immediately, building support and credibility while avoiding Caldwell's attention until she was ready to spring her trap. Emma spent that evening in her small room above the shop, staring at the sheet music Professor Whitman had sent and planning the most audacious performance of her life. She would use her voice not just to entertain, but to expose corruption, rally community resistance, and demonstrate that even in the frontier wilderness, truth and beauty could triumph over greed and intimidation. The transformation of Emma Blackwood was about to begin in earnest, and Judge Harrison Caldwell had no idea that his greatest enemy was hiding in plain sight, preparing to destroy him with weapons he would never see coming until it was far too late to defend against them. Parts 10 to 14. The Voice of Vengeance. The morning Emma decided to openly reveal her musical abilities to the wider community, she chose the most dramatic setting possible, Mrs. Dorothy Kane's front porch, where the elderly widow sat sorting through the legal documents that would strip her of everything she had worked a lifetime to build. The autumn air carried the scent of pine and wood smoke, and golden leaves drifted across the ranch yard where cattle grazed peacefully, unaware that their home would soon be sold to the highest bidder in Judge Caldwell's rigged auction. Emma approached the porch carrying a basket of mended clothes, her usual excuse for visiting isolated homesteads. But today she also carried sheet music concealed beneath the fabric. Mrs. Kane looked up from her papers, her weathered face showing the strain of sleepless nights and impossible choices, but her eyes still held the fierce dignity that had sustained her through decades of frontier hardship. "Miss Blackwood," Mrs. Kane said, attempting a smile that didn't quite hide her despair. "You're kind to make the trip out here, but I'm afraid I may not be able to pay for mending much longer." Emma settled into the wooden chair beside the older woman, studying the legal documents with the careful attention of someone who understood their true significance. "Mrs. Kane, these papers represent more than just your ranch. They represent everything that Willowbrook could become if good people are allowed to build without interference from those who profit from others' misfortune." Mrs. Kane nodded wearily. "I've lived through Indian raids, drought, harsh winters, and cattle disease, Miss Blackwood. But I never thought I'd be defeated by a man with a gavel who calls theft justice." Emma reached into her basket and withdrew the sheet music, smoothing the pages with careful hands. "Mrs. Kane, I want to share something with you that might seem strange given our circumstances. But sometimes when words fail us, music can express truths that need to be heard." Before Mrs. Kane could respond, Emma began to sing. Her voice started softly, carrying the opening notes of Amazing Grace with such pure beauty that the older woman's breath caught audibly. But as the hymn progressed, Emma's voice grew stronger and more powerful, revealing layers of technical skill and emotional depth that transformed the familiar melody into something transcendent. Mrs. Kane sat transfixed as Emma's voice soared across the ranch yard, each note carrying perfect pitch and breathtaking control. The cattle in the distance actually stopped grazing to listen, and birds fell silent as if recognizing that they were in the presence of something extraordinary. When Emma reached the verse about being lost and then found, her voice carried such conviction that Mrs. Kane felt tears streaming down her cheeks. "My dear child," Mrs. Kane whispered when the song ended, "where did you learn to sing like that?" Emma smiled, feeling the liberation that came from finally allowing her true self to emerge. "I studied in Boston with some of the finest voice teachers in America, Mrs. Kane. I performed in venues where people traveled hundreds of miles just to hear music that could lift their spirits and remind them of beauty in a harsh world." Mrs. Kane studied Emma's face with new understanding. "And what brings a Boston-trained opera singer to a frontier seamstress shop in Willowbrook Territory?" "The same thing that's going to save your ranch and expose Judge Caldwell for the corrupt thief he really is," Emma replied with quiet confidence. "The belief that sometimes the most powerful weapon against injustice is showing people what they're truly capable of achieving when they refuse to accept defeat." Over the following week, word of Emma's extraordinary voice spread through Willowbrook with the speed that only truly remarkable news could achieve in a small community. People who had known her as a quiet seamstress began stopping by her shop, with transparent excuses just to hear her hum while she worked. Father Santos arranged for her to sing during Sunday service, and her performance of the morning hymns left the congregation speechless with wonder. But Emma's most important audience was Judge Harrison Caldwell himself, who began hearing descriptions of the mysterious singer from multiple sources. His vanity and his weakness for beautiful women made him inevitably curious about this hidden talent that had emerged in his domain. Emma had counted on this curiosity, understanding that powerful men always wanted to possess what others admired. The trap was set when Marcus Webb approached Caldwell with a carefully rehearsed proposal. The saloon owner suggested that hosting sophisticated entertainment at the Golden Horseshoe would demonstrate Willowbrook's readiness for the kind of development that territorial investors were considering. He mentioned that a local woman had revealed remarkable vocal abilities and might be persuaded to perform for distinguished guests. Emma watched from her shop window as Caldwell emerged from the saloon with the satisfied expression of a man who believed he was about to acquire something valuable. She had anticipated this moment for weeks, preparing for the delicate balance of attraction and resistance that would be necessary to maintain his interest while gathering the evidence she needed to destroy him. That evening, Caldwell appeared at Emma's shop with the casual arrogance of a man accustomed to having his desires fulfilled without question. He was an imposing figure at 53, silver-haired and well-dressed in the finest clothes that territorial money could buy. His eyes held the cold calculation of someone who viewed other people as resources to be exploited, rather than individuals deserving of respect. "Miss Blackwood," Caldwell said, removing his hat with exaggerated courtesy, "I understand you've been hiding extraordinary talents from our community. I'm here to discuss how we might showcase those abilities in ways that would benefit everyone involved." Emma curtsied with perfect grace, drawing on years of social training that had prepared her for exactly this kind of encounter. "Your Honor, I'm flattered by your interest, but I'm just a simple seamstress who enjoys singing hymns at church." Caldwell's smile revealed teeth that were too white and too perfect, like everything else about his carefully constructed image. "Miss Blackwood, I've heard descriptions of your voice that suggest considerably more than amateur church singing. I'm prepared to offer you opportunities that could transform your circumstances significantly." Emma allowed uncertainty to flicker across her features, playing the role of a woman tempted by possibilities beyond her current station. "What kind of opportunities, Your Honor?" "Private performances for distinguished visitors," Caldwell replied smoothly. "Territorial officials and investors who appreciate refined entertainment. Such performances could be quite lucrative for someone with the right guidance." Emma recognized the implicit offer and the threat that accompanied it. Caldwell was proposing to make her his kept entertainer, available for the pleasure of his associates and completely dependent on his favor. The suggestion carried the unspoken warning that refusing his offer could result in the kind of accidents and misfortunes that befell others who disappointed him. "Your Honor," Emma said carefully, "I would need to understand exactly what would be expected of such performances." Caldwell stepped closer, his presence filling Emma's small shop with the oppressive weight of assumed authority. "Nothing more than using your God-given talents to bring beauty and culture to our growing community. Of course, such arrangements require discretion and absolute loyalty to those who provide the opportunities." Emma nodded as if considering his offer, while her mind catalogued every detail of his appearance and manner for future reference. "I'm honored by your interest, Your Honor, but I would need time to prepare properly for such sophisticated audiences." "Of course," Caldwell agreed. "But I trust you understand that opportunities like this don't remain available indefinitely. Other arrangements could be made if you prove uncooperative." After Caldwell left, Emma sat in her shop feeling the full weight of the game she was playing. The judge had revealed exactly what she had expected: his belief that he could control her through a combination of opportunity and intimidation. But he had also given her something invaluable: direct access to his private meetings with the territorial officials who were enabling his corruption. Emma's preparation for the performance that would expose Caldwell entered its final phase when the territorial investors confirmed their visit to Willowbrook. The delegation would include railroad developers, mining investors, and government officials with the power to approve or deny the development projects that would determine the region's future. Most importantly, it would include Territorial Marshal Captain Frank Donovan, whose jurisdiction superseded Caldwell's local authority. Emma spent her days gathering the final pieces of evidence she would need while maintaining her cover as the reluctant performer being courted by the judge. She documented his bribes through careful observation of his meetings, recorded his threats against community members, and collected financial records that proved his systematic theft of public resources. But her most damning evidence came from Caldwell himself, who had grown increasingly confident in her supposed cooperation. During their private meetings to discuss her upcoming performances, he boasted about his control over territorial development, his manipulation of legal proceedings, and his plans to acquire vast land holdings before railroad construction began. Emma recorded these conversations using the mechanical dictation device that Tom Mitchell had acquired through his newspaper contacts, hiding the equipment in her sewing basket during meetings that Caldwell assumed were purely social. The judge's arrogance made him careless with information that could destroy him. And Emma collected every word with the patience of someone who understood that single chance she would have to spring her trap. The night before the territorial delegation's arrival, Emma met with her network of allies in the basement of St. Mary's Chapel. Father Santos, Tom Mitchell, Dr. Hartwell, Billy Harper, Marcus Webb, and Mrs. Kane gathered around tables covered with evidence, performance materials, and detailed plans for the most audacious public exposure of corruption that Willowbrook Territory had ever witnessed. "Ladies and gentlemen," Emma said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had transformed from hidden seamstress to community leader, "tomorrow night we either liberate Willowbrook from Judge Caldwell's tyranny or we all face consequences that could destroy us. Are you certain you're prepared for what we're about to attempt?" Tom Mitchell spread the latest edition of the Willowbrook Gazette across the table, its headline announcing the cultural festival and featuring a prominent article about the mysterious local singer who would be performing for distinguished visitors. The story's been picked up by newspapers in 3 territories. "Whatever happens tomorrow night, it's going to have witnesses." Dr. Hartwell nodded grimly. "I've prepared medical supplies and arranged for emergency transportation if things go badly, but I believe what we're doing is worth the risk." Billy Harper looked nervous but determined. "I've studied every applicable law, Miss Blackwood. If your evidence is as strong as you claim, Captain Donovan will have no choice but to act, regardless of Caldwell's connections." Mrs. Kane reached across the table to squeeze Emma's hand. "Child, you're risking everything to save my ranch and this community. Whatever happens, I want you to know that your courage has already changed all of us." Emma felt the weight of their trust and the magnitude of what she was attempting. "Tomorrow night, I'm going to perform pieces that will demonstrate not just vocal ability, but the kind of artistic sophistication that proves Willowbrook is ready for the cultural and economic development that railroad access will bring. But more importantly, I'm going to use that performance to expose every detail of Caldwell's corruption in a way that he can't deny, suppress, or explain away." Father Santos smiled with quiet confidence. "Emma, I've heard you sing in private. Tomorrow night, when you perform for an audience that includes some of the most powerful people in the territory, they're going to witness something that will stay with them for the rest of their lives." The evening of the performance arrived. With perfect autumn weather, crisp air, and brilliant stars that seemed to promise favorable omens for the night's events. The Golden Horseshoe Saloon had been transformed into an elegant venue with borrowed decorations, additional seating, and lighting that created an atmosphere of sophisticated entertainment rarely seen on the frontier. Emma prepared for her performance. In the small room above the saloon, wearing a gown that Rebecca Stone had created from fabric ordered specially from Denver. The dress was midnight blue silk that complemented her green eyes and auburn hair, elegant enough for any opera house, but practical enough for the evening's true purpose. As she applied the final touches to her appearance, Emma could hear the sounds of the gathering audience below. Territorial officials, railroad developers, mining investors, and prominent local citizens filled the saloon, creating the kind of mixed audience that would ensure her revelations reached both the corrupt and those with the power to stop them. Judge Caldwell had positioned himself at the front table, surrounded by the territorial visitors he was hoping to impress with his control over local cultural resources. He wore his finest suit and his most confident expression, completely unaware that the woman he believed he controlled was about to orchestrate his complete destruction. Emma descended the stairs to find an audience that fell silent at her appearance. She moved to the small stage that Marcus Webb had constructed, carrying herself with the poise and presence that years of performance training had made second nature. The room's atmosphere shifted as people recognized that they were about to witness something extraordinary. "Ladies and gentlemen," Emma began, her voice carrying clearly to every corner of the saloon, "tonight I want to share with you music that speaks to the dreams and aspirations that brought all of us to this frontier territory. But more importantly, I want to share truths that will help us build the kind of community that those dreams deserve. She began with Puccini's O mio babbino caro, her voice soaring with such beauty and power that conversation ceased entirely. The audience sat transfixed as Emma demonstrated vocal abilities that belonged on the world's greatest stages, technique and artistry that transformed the frontier saloon into a cathedral of human achievement. But as her performance progressed, Emma began incorporating spoken passages between songs, sharing stories about community strength, the importance of justice, and the courage required to stand against corruption. Her words were carefully chosen to educate her audience about the evidence she was about to present while building emotional connection that would make her revelations impossible to dismiss. When she reached the climactic moment of her performance, Emma's voice carried Verdi's La Donna e Mobile with such passion and conviction that even Judge Caldwell found himself applauding enthusiastically. But as the final notes faded, Emma's expression grew serious, and the room sensed that the evening's true purpose was about to be revealed. "Distinguished guests," Emma said, her voice now carrying the authority of someone prepared to speak truth regardless of consequences. "You came here tonight expecting entertainment, but what you're going to receive is education about the systematic corruption that threatens everything this territory could become." She began presenting evidence with the methodical precision of a prosecutor, displaying financial records that proved Caldwell's theft, playing recordings of his confessions, and providing documentation of his manipulation of legal proceedings. The territorial officials listened with growing shock and anger as Emma revealed the scope of corruption that had been hidden beneath Willowbrook's peaceful surface. Judge Caldwell rose from his seat, his face flushed with rage and panic. "This is outrageous. This woman is making false accusations based on fabricated evidence." Captain Donovan stood as well, his hand resting on his weapon. "Judge Caldwell, based on what I've heard tonight, you're under arrest for corruption, theft of public funds, and abuse of judicial authority." Emma watched as her carefully planned trap closed around the man who had terrorized Willowbrook for years. But her greatest satisfaction came from seeing the faces of her community members, people who had lived in fear and resignation, discovering that courage and justice could triumph over seemingly overwhelming power. As territorial marshals led Caldwell away in chains, Emma felt the transformation that had begun months earlier finally complete itself. She was no longer the hidden seamstress seeking safety in anonymity, nor was she the frightened woman who had fled Boston to escape scandal. She had become something new, a leader who understood that sometimes the greatest service to community comes from risking everything to expose the truth. Mrs. Kane's ranch was saved. The railroad development proceeded under honest oversight, and Willowbrook became a model for how frontier communities could protect themselves against corruption while building toward a prosperous future. But Emma's greatest achievement was demonstrating that extraordinary power often lay hidden in the most unlikely people, waiting for the right moment to emerge and change everything. The Opera House was completed the following spring, and Emma's opening night performance drew audiences from across the territory. But she never forgot that her true debut had taken place in a frontier saloon, where her voice had carried not just music but justice, not just beauty but truth, proving that sometimes the most powerful weapon against tyranny is simply refusing to remain silent when silence serves only those who profit from others' fear. Willowbrook Territory thrived under honest leadership. The railroad brought prosperity to families who had worked honestly to earn it, and Emma Blackwood became a legend whose story inspired other communities to believe that no corruption was too entrenched to defeat when good people found the courage to stand together and use whatever gifts they possessed in service of justice. Years later, when people asked Emma how a simple seamstress had managed to bring down a corrupt judge, she would smile and remind them that there was nothing simple about anyone who had survived long enough to reach the frontier, and that the Most dangerous opponents were often those who had learned to hide their strength until the moment it was needed most. 5 years after the night that changed Willowbrook Territory forever, Emma Blackwood stood on the stage of the completed opera house, adjusting the final details of her costume before what had become the most anticipated performance of the year. The building around her hummed with the energy of a full house, voices from across 3 territories mingling in animated conversation as people took their seats for the annual Justice Festival, a celebration that had grown far beyond anything the founders had imagined. The opera house itself bore little resemblance to the modest structure originally planned by hopeful townspeople. Railroad money and territorial investment had transformed the simple building into an architectural marvel that rivaled venues in Denver and San Francisco. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over velvet seats and gilded balconies, while acoustic engineering ensured that even whispered conversations on stage could be heard clearly in the furthest reaches of the hall. But for all its grandeur, the building had never lost the spirit of community cooperation that had made its construction possible. Local artisans had contributed woodwork and metalwork that bore the distinctive character of frontier craftsmanship, while donated artwork from grateful families decorated walls and lobbies with scenes of territorial life that celebrated both struggle and triumph. Emma caught her reflection in the full-length mirror that Rebecca Stone had installed in the main dressing room, noting how the years had changed her in ways that went far beyond the natural progression of age. At 31, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had discovered not just her own power, but her responsibility to use it wisely. The timid seamstress who had once hidden her talents behind careful anonymity had evolved into a woman whose presence commanded attention and whose voice had become synonymous with courage throughout the region. Her costume tonight was a creation that told its own story of transformation and triumph. Rebecca Stone had designed the gown to incorporate elements from Emma's journey, with embroidery that depicted musical notes flowing into scales of justice and fabric that shifted from the simple browns and grays of frontier life to the rich blues and golds of artistic achievement. The dress was beautiful enough for any stage in the world, but its true power lay in its symbolism of what ordinary people could accomplish when they refused to accept limitations imposed by others. A soft knock interrupted Emma's preparations, and Tom Mitchell entered the dressing room, carrying the latest edition of what had become the most widely read newspaper in the territory. The Willowbrook Gazette now employed 12 full-time reporters and correspondents, with circulation extending across state lines and regular reprinting in major Eastern publications that recognized Tom's unique perspective on frontier justice and community development. "Emma," Tom said, his face beaming with satisfaction, "you need to see tonight's final edition. The story about the corruption prosecution program has been picked up by newspapers in 17 states." Emma accepted the paper, scanning headlines that described how the Willowbrook model had been implemented in communities across the American West, the systematic approach to identifying and prosecuting corrupt officials that had emerged from her confrontation with Judge Caldwell had become a template that territorial governments actively promoted and funded. 43 successful prosecutions this year alone, Tom continued, pride evident in his voice. And that's just in our immediate region. The Attorney General's office estimates that the total impact has prevented millions of dollars in theft and restored faith in legal institutions that people were beginning to abandon entirely. Emma nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility that came with knowing how many communities had found hope through the example of one woman's refusal to remain silent. But she also felt satisfaction at seeing justice multiply and spread like ripples from a stone thrown into still water. Dr. Hartwell appeared in the doorway, his medical bag in hand and his expression carrying the professional concern of someone who had become Emma's personal physician as well as trusted friend. The years had been kind to the doctor, who had found renewed purpose in treating patients who no longer feared seeking medical care. because they couldn't afford the bribes that had once been necessary to ensure quality treatment. "Emma, Dr. Hartwell said with gentle authority, I know tonight's performance means everything to you, but I need you to remember that you're human, not a machine. Your voice is an instrument that requires care and respect." Emma smiled at the familiar concern. Dr. Hartwell had been monitoring her health carefully since she began performing regularly, understanding that the emotional intensity of her concerts could take a toll that went far beyond mere physical exhaustion. Her performances weren't simple entertainment. They were acts of community healing that demanded everything she had to give. "I'm ready, Doctor," Emma assured him. "Tonight's program is designed to celebrate how far we've come while honoring those who made the journey possible." Through the dressing room window, Emma could see the crowds still arriving at the opera house, their faces bright with anticipation and pride. Families who had once lived in fear now walked with heads held high, children who had grown up witnessing justice triumphant over corruption carried themselves with the confidence that came from believing in the power of community action. Billy Harper appeared at the door, no longer the uncertain young deputy who had once struggled with conflicting loyalties. Now serving as territorial marshal for the region, Billy had become a symbol of law enforcement that served justice rather than personal interest. His badge carried authority that was respected rather than feared, earned through years of consistent service to the communities he protected. "Emma," Billy said, his voice carrying the warmth of friendship forged through shared struggle. "Captain Donovan just arrived with the delegation from the capital. They're hoping to meet with you after tonight's performance to discuss expanding the community justice program to the Northern Territories." Emma felt a familiar thrill at the prospect of helping more communities discover their own power to resist corruption. Each new region that implemented their model represented hundreds of families who would be protected from the kind of systematic theft that had once threatened to destroy Willowbrook. "Tell Captain Donovan I'd be honored to discuss whatever assistance we can provide," Emma replied. "But remind him that the real power of our approach comes from communities discovering their own strengths, not from having solutions imposed from outside." Father Santos entered the dressing room carrying the evening's program, his face glowing with the satisfaction of someone who had witnessed his faith in human potential validated beyond his wildest dreams. The priest had become Emma's closest advisor and confidant, the one person who fully understood both the magnitude of what she had accomplished and the personal cost of carrying such responsibility. "Emma," Father Santos said, his voice carrying the gentle authority that had made him beloved throughout the territory, "I wanted you to know that tonight's audience includes delegations from communities in 7 different territories. They're here not just to hear you perform, but to learn from what Willowbrook has achieved." Emma studied the program, noting names and organizations that represented the expansion of everything she had hoped to accomplish. Agricultural cooperatives, mining unions, territorial women's associations, and educational foundations had all sent representatives to witness how culture and justice could work together to transform entire regions. "Father," Emma said thoughtfully, "sometimes I look at audiences like tonight's and wonder if we've created something too large for any one person to guide effectively." Father Santos smiled with the wisdom of someone who had watched a terrified young woman transform into a leader whose influence extended across state lines. "Emma, the beauty of what you've built is that it doesn't depend on any single person. You taught communities to find their own voices, their own strength, their own methods of protecting what they value. That's why it continues to grow and spread." Marcus Webb knocked and entered, his usually jovial expression replaced by the focused intensity he showed during important events. As the unofficial coordinator of major community celebrations, Marcus had developed organizational skills that rivaled professional event planners, turning every performance at the Opera House into a demonstration of what communities could achieve through cooperation. "Emma," Marcus announced, "we have a full house with standing room only." The fire marshal has approved our temporary seating arrangements, and we've got people listening from the street through the open windows. I'd estimate total attendance at just over 2,000. Emma felt her pulse quicken at the magnitude of the audience waiting for her. 2,000 people represented not just the population of Willowbrook, but visitors who had traveled hundreds of miles to witness what had become more than a performance. Her concerts had evolved into celebrations of community empowerment that inspired attendees to return home and implement similar programs in their own regions. Mrs. Kane appeared in the doorway, moving with the vitality of someone whose life had been restored through justice rather than charity. The ranch that Judge Caldwell had tried to steal through legal manipulation had become one of the most prosperous operations in the territory, but more importantly, it had become a symbol of what honest people could build when protected from corruption. "Emma, dear," Mrs. Kane said with maternal affection, "I wanted to thank you once more before tonight's performance. But more than that, I wanted you to know that there are young women in the audience tonight who see you as proof that they don't have to accept limitations that others try to place on them." Emma felt the emotional weight of serving as an example for other women who might be hiding their own extraordinary abilities behind facades of ordinariness. Her story had become particularly important to women who had been taught that safety lay in invisibility, that drawing attention was dangerous, that power belonged exclusively to men. "Mrs. Kane," Emma replied, "what happened to your ranch to all of us proves that ordinary people possess extraordinary power when they decide to use it. Tonight's performance is just another reminder of that truth." Rebecca Stone entered carrying the final accessories for Emma's costume, her seamstress skills having evolved far beyond simple frontier mending to become artistry that was sought after by wealthy families across multiple territories. Rebecca's success represented the kind of economic opportunity that flourished when communities were freed from the burden of systematic corruption. "Emma," Rebecca said as she made final adjustments to the gown, "I've been thinking about what tonight represents. 5 years ago, we were all just trying to survive in a town controlled by people who saw us as resources to be exploited. Tonight, we're celebrating our transformation into a community that other regions look to for inspiration." Emma nodded, understanding that Rebecca was expressing something that all of them felt but rarely articulated directly. They had become something more than what they had originally hoped to be, not through accident or luck, but through deliberate choices to support each other and refuse to accept injustice as inevitable. The stage manager appeared at the dressing room door, clipboard in hand and expression focused on the complex logistics of managing a performance that would be remembered throughout the territory. Emma's concerts had grown far beyond simple entertainment to become carefully orchestrated events that required coordination between multiple organizations and jurisdictions. "Miss Blackwood," the stage manager announced, "we're ready for your entrance. Tonight's program will be broadcast by telegraph to newspapers in 12 cities, and we have stenographers recording for the territorial archives." Emma took a final look in the mirror, seeing not just her own reflection, but the faces of everyone who had contributed to this moment. Tom Mitchell's courage in reporting truth despite threats, Dr. Hartwell's dedication to serving his community despite personal risk, Billy Harper's choice to uphold actual law rather than corrupt orders, Father Santus's faith in human potential despite evidence of human weakness, Marcus Webb's willingness to risk his business to support justice, Mrs. Kane's refusal to surrender to theft, disguised as legal procedure, Rebecca Stone's transformation from survival to artistry. All of their individual choices had combined to create something larger than any of them could have achieved alone, something that continued to grow and inspire similar achievements in communities across the American West. Emma's voice had been the instrument of their collective courage, but that courage had belonged to all of them from the beginning. Emma walked from the dressing room toward the stage, her footsteps echoing through corridors lined with photographs and artwork that documented Willowbrook's transformation. Images showed the town before Caldwell's corruption was exposed, during the difficult period of rebuilding trust and institutions, and in its current state as a thriving community that attracted visitors from across the nation. As she approached the stage, Emma could hear the audience settling into expectant silence. 2,000 people preparing to witness something that had become legendary throughout the territory. But she also heard something more, the sound of a community that had learned to believe in its own power, people who had discovered that justice was not something granted by authorities, but something created through collective action. The curtains parted, and Emma stepped into the spotlight, her voice ready to carry not just music but the continuing story of what ordinary people could accomplish when they refused to accept that corruption and injustice were inevitable parts of life. The performance that followed would be remembered not just for its artistic excellence, but for its demonstration that sometimes the most powerful revolution begins with a single voice refusing to remain silent. The opera house filled with the sound of Emma's voice, carrying melodies that spoke of struggle and triumph, of communities discovering their own strength, and of the truth that every person possessed the power to change their world if they could find the courage to use whatever gifts they had been given in service of something greater than themselves. As the final notes of her performance echoed through the hall and the audience rose in thunderous applause, Emma knew that the story begun 5 years earlier in a seamstress shop would continue to grow and inspire long after her own voice had been silenced by time. The song that had brought down a corrupt judge had become a symphony of community empowerment that would play across the American frontier for generations to come. As the final notes of her performance echoed through the hall and the audience rose in thunderous applause, Emma knew that the story begun 5 years earlier in a seamstress shop would continue to grow and inspire long after her own voice had been silenced by time. The song that had brought down a corrupt judge had become a symphony of community empowerment that would play across the American frontier for generations to come. But tonight held one more surprise that would cement Emma's legacy in ways she had never anticipated. As the applause gradually subsided and the audience began to settle back into their seats, Captain Frank Donovan rose from his position in the front row, his territorial marshal's uniform gleaming in the opera house lights. The crowd fell silent, sensing that something significant was about to occur. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Donovan announced, his voice carrying clearly throughout the hall, "before we conclude this remarkable evening, I have the honor of presenting Miss Emma Blackwood with a special recognition from the Territorial Governor and the United States Department of Justice." Emma felt her breath catch as Captain Donovan produced an official document bearing multiple seals and signatures. The parchment seemed to glow in the stage lights, its formal language representing recognition that extended far beyond anything she had ever imagined possible. "Miss Blackwood," Captain Donovan continued, "by order of the Territorial Governor, and with the approval of federal authorities, you are hereby appointed as the first regional coordinator for community justice initiatives, with authority to establish and oversee anti-corruption programs throughout the Western Territories." The audience erupted in applause that seemed to shake the very foundations of the opera house. Emma stood frozen on the stage, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was being offered to her. The position represented not just personal recognition, but the opportunity to transform her individual victory into a systematic approach that could protect communities across the entire frontier. Tom Mitchell rose from his seat, his journalist's instincts recognizing the historical significance of the moment. "Miss Blackwood," he called out, "what does this appointment mean for communities that are still struggling under corrupt leadership?" Emma found her voice, drawing on the same courage that had carried her through her confrontation with Judge Caldwell. "Mr. Mitchell, it means that no community has to face corruption alone anymore. It means that the methods we developed here in Willowbrook will be available to every settlement, every town, every territory that needs them." Dr. Hartwell stood and addressed the crowd, his medical training having taught him to think in terms of prevention rather than just treatment. Miss Blackwood, how do you plan to identify communities that need assistance before corruption becomes as entrenched as it was here? Emma smiled, her mind already racing through the possibilities that her new authority would create. Doctor, we're going to establish a network of community health assessments that evaluate not just economic and social conditions, but the integrity of local institutions. Communities will learn to recognize the early warning signs of corruption before it becomes a crisis. Father Santos rose from his seat, his expression glowing with pride and satisfaction. Emma, this appointment represents more than professional recognition. It represents the Church's belief that your work serves a higher purpose. Emma nodded, understanding the deeper meaning of the priest's words. Her journey from hidden seamstress to regional coordinator represented the kind of transformation that gave meaning to everyone's struggles, proof that individual courage could indeed change the world. Mrs. Kane stood slowly, her weathered hands gripping the back of her seat for support, but her voice carrying clearly throughout the hall. Miss Blackwood, you saved my ranch, but more than that, you saved my faith in justice. What can old folks like me do to help you expand this work? Emma felt tears threatening as she looked out at faces that represented not just personal friendships, but a community that had discovered its own power through collective action. Mrs. Kane, every person in this room who refuses to accept corruption as inevitable becomes part of the solution. Your stories, your examples, your willingness to stand up for what's right. That's how we change the world. Billy Harper stepped forward, his marshal's badge catching the light as he moved. Miss Blackwood, as a law enforcement officer, I want to know how we can ensure that this program maintains the highest ethical standards as it expands. Emma appreciated the question, understanding that Billy was addressing concerns about how power could corrupt even well-intentioned programs. Marshal Harper, transparency and accountability will be built into every aspect of our operations. Communities will evaluate us just as rigorously as we help them evaluate their own institutions. Rebecca Stone called out from the balcony, her voice carrying the practical concerns of someone who had built a business from nothing. Emma, what kind of resources will be available to help communities implement these programs? Emma looked up at her friend, seeing not just a successful businesswoman, but a symbol of what people could achieve when freed from the burden of corruption. Rebecca will provide training, materials, and ongoing support, but the most important resource will always be the community's own determination to build something better. Marcus Webb stepped into the center aisle, his saloon owner's understanding of human nature making him ask the hard questions. Miss Blackwood, what happens when you encounter communities where the corruption is so deep that people have given up hope entirely? Emma considered the question carefully, knowing that her answer would define her approach to the most challenging situations she would face. Marcus, that's where we start with culture and inspiration before we move to direct action. Sometimes people need to remember what they're fighting for before they can find the strength to fight. As the impromptu question and answer session continued, Emma realized that what was happening went far beyond a simple appointment ceremony. The community that had supported her transformation was now helping to define how that transformation would serve others, contributing their wisdom and experience to shape a program that would protect communities across the frontier. Captain Donovan stepped forward again, holding up his hand for silence. Miss Blackwood, there's one more aspect of this appointment that I think will interest you. The program will be headquartered here in Willowbrook, ensuring that this community remains at the center of anti-corruption efforts throughout the region. The announcement brought the audience to its feet again, understanding that their town would become a destination for people seeking to learn how communities could protect themselves. Willowbrook would no longer be just another frontier settlement. It would be a symbol of what American democracy could achieve when citizens refused to surrender their power to those who would abuse it. Emma looked out over the standing ovation. seeing faces that represented every aspect of her journey, from frightened refugee to empowered leader. But she also saw something more, the future that they were creating together. A future where corruption would be met not with resignation, but with organized resistance, where communities would know they possessed the power to protect what they valued most. "My friends," Emma said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned the right to speak for justice. "5 years ago, I came to Willowbrook hoping to disappear. Instead, I discovered that the greatest safety comes not from hiding, but from standing with others who share your values. Tonight, we begin a new chapter in that story." The opera house erupted in sustained applause that seemed to go on forever. 2,000 voices raised in celebration of what they had achieved and excitement about what lay ahead. Emma stood at the center of it all, no longer the hidden seamstress or even the courageous performer, but something new, a leader whose influence would extend across state lines and whose methods would protect communities for generations to come. As the evening finally drew to a close and people began to file out of the opera house, Emma remained on stage, overwhelmed by the journey that had brought her to this moment. Tom Mitchell approached with his notebook, ready to record her thoughts for posterity. "Emma," Tom said quietly, "how does it feel to know that your refusal to remain silent has become a movement that will outlive all of us?" Emma smiled, her hand touching the appointment document that would define the rest of her life. "Tom, it feels like the song I was meant to sing all along. Not just for one performance, not just for one community, but for every person who has ever been told they don't have the power to change their world." The lights in the opera house began to dim, but Emma's voice carried one final message to the few people still remaining in the hall. The woman who was afraid to sing in public became someone whose voice could bring down corruption. If that transformation is possible, then anything is possible for anyone brave enough to try. As Emma finally left the stage that night, she carried with her not just the satisfaction of personal triumph, but the weight and privilege of knowing that her individual courage had become a tool for justice that would serve communities across the American frontier for decades to come. The seamstress who had once hidden her talents had become the architect of a movement that would ensure no community would ever again have to face corruption alone. The song that had begun in fear and desperation had become an anthem of hope that would echo across the territories, proving that sometimes the most powerful revolution begins not with armies or politics, but with one person finding the courage to use whatever gifts they possess in service of something greater than themselves. 3 weeks after her appointment ceremony, Emma found herself standing in the doorway of what had once been Judge Caldwell's private chambers, now converted into the headquarters of the Regional Community Justice Initiative. The irony was not lost on her that the room where so much corruption had been planned would now serve as the nerve center for eliminating such practices throughout the territory. The space had been completely transformed, with Caldwell's intimidating judicial furniture replaced by practical work tables where teams of investigators, legal scholars, and community organizers collaborated on cases from across the region. Maps covered the walls, marked with colored pins that indicated communities at various stages of implementing anti-corruption programs. Red pins showed areas where investigations were active, yellow indicated communities undergoing assessment, and green marked successful program implementations. Emma moved to the large window that overlooked Willowbrook's main street, watching the morning bustle of a town that had become a destination rather than just a waypoint. Delegations arrived daily, representatives from settlements scattered across 3 territories who came seeking training, advice, and most importantly, hope that their own situations could be improved. Her assistant, a young woman named Catherine Walsh, who had traveled from Denver specifically to join the initiative, approached with the morning's correspondence. Catherine possessed the kind of sharp intelligence and organizational skills that Emma had learned to value above all other qualifications. But more importantly, she carried the passionate commitment to justice that had become the hallmark of everyone who joined their movement. Miss Blackwood, Catherine said, spreading documents across Emma's desk. We've received formal requests for assistance from 17 new communities this week alone. The pattern is remarkably consistent. Local officials exploiting their authority for personal gain, while citizens feel powerless to resist. Emma studied the requests, noting locations that ranged from mining camps in Colorado to farming settlements in Kansas. Each letter told a story of systematic abuse that had become so normalized that victims had almost stopped recognizing it as wrong. But each letter also represented people who had heard about Willowbrook's transformation and dared to believe that change might be possible for them as well. Catherine, Emma said thoughtfully, what strikes me most about these requests is how similar they all are to our situation 5 years ago. People who know something is wrong, but don't believe they have the power to change it. Catherine nodded, her expression reflecting the same sense of purpose that had driven Emma's original confrontation with corruption. Miss Blackwood, I've been analyzing the patterns in these requests, and I think we're seeing something unprecedented. Communities are beginning to understand that they don't have to accept corruption as an inevitable part of frontier life. Emma moved to the wall. Map, studying the distribution of pins and recognizing the geographic spread of their influence. Communities throughout the Western Territories were implementing programs based on the Willowbrook model, adapting the basic principles to their own specific circumstances while maintaining the core commitment to transparency, accountability, and citizen empowerment. Dr. Hartwell entered the office carrying his medical bag and a folder containing health assessments from several communities that had requested assistance. The doctor had become an invaluable part of the initiative, developing methods for evaluating the psychological and social impact of corruption that complemented Emma's focus on legal and institutional reform. Emma, Dr. Hartwell said, settling into one of the chairs that faced her desk, I've completed my evaluation of the situation in Silver Creek, Montana. The community is experiencing classic symptoms of systematic intimidation, elevated stress-related illnesses, reluctance to seek medical care, and social isolation that's fragmenting community bonds. Emma accepted the folder, scanning medical data that told a story of human suffering that went far beyond financial theft. Corruption didn't just steal money. It poisoned the social trust that allowed communities to function effectively, creating environments where people lived in constant fear of arbitrary punishment for challenging authority. Doctor, Emma asked, in your medical opinion, how long does it typically take for communities to recover from prolonged exposure to systematic corruption? Dr. Hartwell considered the question with the careful attention he gave to complex diagnoses. The physical symptoms usually improve within months of removing the source of stress. But rebuilding social trust and community confidence can take years, especially in cases where corruption has been generational. Emma nodded, understanding that her work required patience and long-term commitment rather than the dramatic confrontations that made for compelling stories. Real change happened slowly, through countless small victories that gradually shifted the balance of power from those who would exploit communities to those who would protect them. Tom Mitchell arrived carrying the latest edition of a publication that had become essential reading throughout the Western Territories. The Community Justice Gazette now served communities across multiple states, providing information about legal rights, reporting successful anti-corruption efforts, and maintaining communication networks that prevented communities from feeling isolated in their struggles. Emma, Tom announced, his editor's instincts recognizing stories that would resonate with their expanding readership. We've received confirmation that the Colorado Territorial Legislature is considering legislation that would make our community assessment protocols mandatory for all settlements receiving territorial funding. Emma felt a thrill of recognition that their local experiment was becoming institutionalized policy. Legislative adoption would provide resources and authority that could accelerate implementation while ensuring that anti-corruption programs maintained consistent standards across different jurisdictions. Tom, Emma replied, institutional support is crucial, but we need to make sure that bureaucratization doesn't undermine the grassroots empowerment that makes our approach effective. Tom nodded, understanding the delicate balance between scaling up their methods and maintaining the community ownership that made those methods powerful. I've been thinking about that challenge. Emma, perhaps we need to develop training programs that teach communities how to maintain their independence while working within official frameworks. Father Santos entered the office carrying correspondence from religious leaders throughout the region who had become crucial allies in identifying and addressing corruption. The priest's network of contacts had proven invaluable in gathering information about communities where traditional reporting mechanisms had been compromised by corrupt officials. Emma, Father Santos said, his expression carrying both pride and concern, I've received letters from clergy in 12 different territories asking for guidance on how to support anti-corruption efforts without compromising their religious neutrality. Emma appreciated the complexity of the priest's position and the similar challenges faced by other community leaders who wanted to support justice without appearing to take partisan political positions. Father, what guidance are you providing to other religious leaders who want to help their communities? Father Santos smiled with the wisdom of someone who had learned to navigate delicate situations through years of pastoral experience. I'm teaching them that supporting transparency and accountability isn't political partisanship, it's moral obligation. Communities have the right to honest government, and religious leaders have the responsibility to support that right. Billy Harper arrived carrying reports from law enforcement agencies that had begun implementing training programs based on Willowbrook's experiences. The young marshal had become a sought-after speaker at law enforcement conferences, sharing insights about how police and sheriff's departments could serve justice rather than protecting corrupt officials. Emma, Billy said, settling into the remaining chair in what had become their regular morning strategy session. I've completed training programs in 6 different territories, and the response from rank-and-file officers has been overwhelmingly positive. Most law enforcement personnel want to serve their communities honestly. They just need support and protection when challenging corrupt superiors. Emma recognized that Billy had identified one of the most crucial elements in their success, providing protection for individuals who chose to resist corruption rather than accommodate it. Whistleblowers and reform advocates needed to know that they wouldn't face retaliation alone, that their courage would be supported by networks of allies who shared their commitment to justice. Billy, Emma asked, what kind of institutional changes do you think are necessary to protect law enforcement officers who expose corruption within their own departments? Billy's expression grew serious as he considered the question that went to the heart of systemic reform. We need independent oversight mechanisms that can investigate complaints without relying on the same chain of command that might be compromised. And we need legal protections that prevent retaliation against officers who report misconduct. Rebecca Stone entered carrying samples of what had become known as justice quilts, artistic works created by women in communities that had successfully implemented anti-corruption programs. The quilts served both as celebrations of victory and as fundraising tools that supported ongoing reform efforts, demonstrating how cultural expression could serve political empowerment. Emma, Rebecca announced, spreading the quilts across an empty table. We've received orders from museums in San Francisco and Chicago who want to display these as examples of how frontier communities are using art to document their struggles for justice. Emma studied the intricate needlework that told stories of communities discovering their own power to resist exploitation. Each quilt represented countless hours of collaborative work that built social bonds while creating beautiful objects that would preserve their stories for future generations. Rebecca, Emma said thoughtfully, these quilts represent something more than art or fundraising. They're proof that communities can transform their experiences of struggle into sources of strength and beauty. Mrs. Kane appeared in the doorway, moving with the purposeful energy of someone whose life had been restored through justice rather than charity. The elderly woman had become one of Emma's most trusted advisors, contributing wisdom earned through decades of frontier experience while maintaining the fierce determination that had helped her survive Caldwell's attacks. "Emma, dear," Mrs. Kane said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned respect through survival and service. "I've been corresponding with ranch women throughout the territory who are organizing to support your work. We understand that protecting property rights requires protecting the institutions that enforce those rights." Emma appreciated the practical wisdom that Mrs. Kane and her network brought to their efforts. Ranch families understood better than anyone how quickly corrupt officials could destroy decades of honest work, and their support provided crucial credibility with rural communities that might otherwise be suspicious of reform efforts. "Mrs. Kane," Emma replied, "the support of established families like yours demonstrates that anti-corruption work isn't radical politics. It's conservative protection of property rights and community stability." Marcus Webb entered carrying financial reports that documented the economic impact of their anti-corruption programs. Communities that had successfully eliminated systematic theft were experiencing unprecedented prosperity, with increased investment, business development, and population growth that validated their approaches through measurable results. "Emma," Marcus announced, his saloon owner's understanding of economic cycles making him particularly effective at tracking financial improvements. "Communities that have implemented our programs are reporting average economic growth of 30% within 2 years of eliminating major corruption." Emma studied the financial data, recognizing that economic prosperity provided the strongest argument for their methods among skeptics who might question moral or philosophical justifications for reform. When communities could demonstrate that honest government produced better results than corrupt administration, opposition tended to dissolve rapidly. "Marcus," Emma observed, "these numbers prove that corruption isn't just morally wrong, it's economically destructive. Communities that eliminate theft and intimidation create environments where honest businesses can thrive." As the morning strategy session concluded and her team dispersed to their various responsibilities, Emma remained in the office that had once housed the corruption they had fought so hard to eliminate. The transformation of this space represented the larger transformation of their entire region, proof that systematic change was possible when communities refused to accept that injustice was inevitable. Catherine approached with one final document that would define Emma's afternoon schedule. "Miss Blackwood, we've received a special request from the Territorial Governor's office. They want you to testify before a congressional committee that's investigating corruption in Western Territories." Emma felt the weight of responsibility that came with knowing that her individual story had become part of a national conversation about justice, democracy, and the rights of frontier communities. Her testimony would reach beyond their immediate region to influence policy decisions that could protect communities throughout the American West. "Catherine," Emma replied, understanding that accepting this invitation would mark another expansion of their influence and responsibility. "Prepare a response accepting the invitation. It's time for our local example to contribute to national reform." As Emma prepared for the afternoon's work of reviewing cases, training materials, and correspondence from communities throughout the region, she reflected on the journey that had transformed her from a frightened woman hiding in a seamstress shop to a leader whose influence extended across state lines and whose methods were being studied by government officials at the highest levels. The voice that had once been silenced by fear had become an instrument of justice that continued to grow stronger and reach further with each community that chose courage over compliance, truth over convenience, and collective action over individual resignation. The song that had begun with her defiance of Judge Caldwell had become a chorus that would echo across the American frontier for generations to come. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.